Hi everyone, so I'm recording our final lecture for the semester. So for SOCI 3012, Taking It to the Streets, recording a lecture about reflective practice. So a good way to finish the semester to think about how you can take reflective practice with you into the workplace, but into other areas of your life as well. So what we're going to be talking about is a particular form or process of thinking called reflection. You may have already come across it before. It is something that we talk about when we're thinking about research in particular, reflecting and being reflexive about our research. But this is a little bit broader than research as well. So it doesn't exclude research, but is broader than that as well. And I want to introduce a range of ideas about reflection. So reflection on action, so reflecting after we've taken some action, reflecting on that action. Reflection in action, which is about reflecting as you carry on with a project or task. And reflection for action, which is really about the planning stage. And also another type of reflective practice, situated reflective practice, which takes account of our physical settings and power relationships as well. And we'll finish up by considering the difference between reflective and reflexive. So I wanted to start off with a very influential early American educationalist, philosopher and psychologist, John Dewey, who's very influential. You'll find that his name pops up if you're reading on reflective practice. So he's very influential in this field. He thinks about thinking as questioning. So a quote from him is, "Thinking is inquiry, investigation, turning over, probing or delving into, so as to find something new or see what is already known in a different light. In short, it is questioning." For Dewey, reflection is an active, persistent and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it. So in other words, is thinking about looking for evidence, thinking about why we believe what we believe, and then to finish that quote and the further conclusions to which it tends. For him, reflective thinking is better than other forms of thinking. For example, streams of consciousness, beliefs, daydreaming. And for him, it's better because it's an orderly process. And questioning is needed to resolve problems, whereas it's not needed for unproblematic situations. So if we're going into thinking about reflexivity and being reflective, then we are thinking about solving problems, gaining new knowledge. So reflection, according to Dewey, has 6 phases. We have something happen, a suggestion of an experience, and then we begin to interpret that, usually spontaneously. And then we, as I said, this is usually about problematic situations, so we name the problem, describe the experience in some way, and then we begin to generate some explanations for the particular problem. And as we're generating them, then we're also analysing those explanations, because what we're hoping to come to is a solution for the problem. And we start experimenting with different ways of improving the situation. And this happens across a whole range of areas. So this could be in architecture. Donald Chon is also a very important person when it comes to reflection. And so he talks about these different phases that happen across a number of different professions. So we have a problem that might occur. So we might have a problem that occurs across a range of professions, so in psychology or as a social scientist, as a researcher, as an academic, any sort of profession, there will be problems arising. And what Chon has noticed is that there is a typical way of proceeding through those processes, which he talks about in reflection on reflection in action. But they kind of follow that process that Dewey talked about as well. So if we're thinking about reflection as a cognitive process, as a thinking process, then it is used, it's a process to make sense of very complex problems. And it's usually triggered by information that is perplexing or challenging. So you're going along and you're designing a house as an architect, and suddenly something doesn't work in the way that it should work, or that you're expecting it to work. So suddenly you're perplexed, and therefore you need to be thinking through that process to find out what the problem is and how you can fix it. So if something is puzzling, then it does suggest that the situation is outside of our existing knowledge or existing understanding. And so this is an opportunity for, problems are actually an opportunity for us to learn something new. And it might result, therefore, in explanatory hypotheses. So hypotheses which we can then go and test. So in the language of Dewey, we start doing some experimenting to find out the solutions to particular problems. Another way of thinking about reflection, though, and this comes from Tony Marshall, is as an integrative process. And what he means by that is it's a process that allows for us to explore and also synthesize or pull together a whole range of different ideas. And then that leads to us constructing a kind of coherent narrative. And I think this is often used in a particular sort of therapy called narrative therapy, where you can synthesize the things that have happened in your life, and it gives you the opportunity then to present it as kind of the journey model, or think about it rather than a whole lot of ad hoc events that have happened. Put that together as kind of the story of your life. So it allows a person to make sense of an experience or the experience of your life. And I imagine that if you're writing an autobiography, for example, or a memoir, then you're doing that integrative process rather than the solving problem, the cognitive process of making sense of your life experience. So, and it therefore allows a person to construct theories for the particular context in which they find themselves, and the theories might be around class or gender and gendered explanations for how your life has worked out, or race, or a whole range of different ways and theories that we can use to explain what's happened to us in our particular lifetime. So general thoughts on theory, going to Donald Shawn, it is a process of thinking about how we're thinking. So when we reflect, he says, we're actually thinking about our thinking and our actions. And that reminds me of Margaret Archer and the whole idea about being meta-reflexive. So if we're meta-reflexive, then we are thinking about our thinking. So that's the whole idea about reflection. So reflection, as I've said before, happens not just in the workplace, but in all other areas of our life. And I've used the example there of somebody who's writing a memoir or an autobiography, or even just a short story on their lives. They're doing a reflection on their life. It involves monitoring our thinking, analysing it, and also solving problems, because often that's what we need to do because something's come up that's puzzling and we don't really understand it. A newer version of Dewey has 4 phases. We have, again, a suggestion, something's happened, a suggestion of experience. We then go through a description phase, describing that experience, what has happened to us. And then we analyse that experience. And think about this when you happen, whenever we're debriefing with somebody about anything. So it might be a relationship problem, it might be something that's happened in a classroom, it might be a problem that we're having with something that we're learning. We kind of always go through these phases, and then we'll take some action. The intelligent action, for example, might be to suspend a relationship with somebody, or it might be to challenge them over their behaviour towards us, or it might be to cut a class and to give up on that particular course because it's not particularly satisfying. So we take some sort of action after thinking and weighing things up, rather than just reaction. Rather than just reacting, we're actually working through a particular reflective process, is what Rogers is talking about. So reflection can be done in a number of ways. The 2 primary ways that I've been noticing when I've been doing research for this lecture is that there's writing and there's talking. When you're talking with somebody, with a supervisor at work, and you're probably going to be supervised, and many of you already have a supervisor in a workplace, so they are somebody that you can go to and talk to about what has been happening in the workplace, and therefore you can reflect on situations. There are some workplaces where a supervisor is particularly important, and I'm thinking there of sort of frontline work with difficult jobs like social workers or police. I don't know whether the police are required to have a supervisor, but somebody that you can talk through difficult situations that you've experienced is often considered a very beneficial part of a workplace when you're doing difficult frontline work. So you can talk with a supervisor, you can debrief with peers, and think about that. When we even have a problem with relationships, then we'll have a chat with somebody about that and reflect on it. If you're seeing a counsellor of any sort, whether that be a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, a social worker, somebody just called a counsellor, then you're always engaged in a reflective process. You're thinking about what has been going on, what the problems are, how you can solve them in your personal life or in your professional life. You can also set up a group as well. So, and you might think about that in terms of a team. So you could do that separate from a team at work. Just a group that you want to reflect on teaching. I do some of those at work. We call them a community of practice, and we reflect on our teaching practice or our research practice or whatever. But you could also do that with your team as well, a direct team where you're reflecting on how a project is to go, what's happened, what might have gone wrong with it, and reflecting afterwards on what you could do better for next time. Another primary way is to be writing in a journal as well, which overtly then represents the ideas that you're thinking about. It creates a record and can be re-examined over a period of time as well. Writing a reflective journal for some people is really important in terms of when they go back to write a memoir or an autobiography, which, as I said, is a reflective type of writing in quite a significant way for some people. The other thing that comes to mind for me that I didn't find certainly in any of the reflective practice literature though is other people who are artists in some way. When they're reflecting on their own lives, then they may paint that. And it reminds me of a woman called Rachel Romero who was in town back in 2012, I think it was, and where she had a period of about 9 months where she was confined to an institution. As a teenager, she had actually gone to the state to report sexual abuse by her father, and what they did was lock her up in an institution, and where she had to work in a laundry when she wasn't at school. And she left there, she got on with her life, she trained as an artist, she left Australia. She didn't really reflect on that experience at all until her husband was dying of cancer many years later, decades later. And she started reflecting then on that childhood, and what she did was paint her childhood, and she had a series of paintings about her experience in this laundry. And she used that as in an exhibition in Adelaide. So while I'm talking about the primary ways that you'll think about reflective practice as talking and writing, for artists, there's other ways of doing that as well. For Sean, powerful questions actually help people to reflect on their thinking. So for him, people with a limited set of questions are not so good at reflective practice or at reflective learning. So it's those really important questions. And that's where, if you are with a good supervisor or a good therapist, a good counsellor, somebody who can ask you really good questions, it does help to encourage a different practice of reflection. Reflection in action comes from Donald Shon. He talks about how much of our daily knowledge, now this is not his idea, this is an insight from Michael Polanyi back in 1958, but he talks about how so much of our daily knowledge is tacit. That is, that it's difficult to transfer to another person. And I remember doing years ago up at Flinders University, I took a course on teaching, and we were asked to break down tying shoelaces so that we could transfer that knowledge to another person. And believe me, give it a go, but I found that quite a difficult task to do, and I must have had to do that in order to teach my children as well. But it is one of those tasks that's actually quite a difficult thing to break it down, particularly if you've been doing something for a long period of time. So anything that you do on automatic pilot, so the same when I was teaching my teenagers how to drive, then I had to suddenly think about things that I had taken for granted. So knowledge that really is quite tacit rather than explicit. So it is skills and knowledge an experience that might not be written down, might not be codified in some particular way. Perhaps it is these days with the internet, who knows, tying shoelaces, maybe we can learn to do it that way. And people aren't always aware of the knowledge that they have. So if you're kneading dough, if you're doing anything and you've got a small child and the small child asks you how to do it, suddenly you realise that you have a whole lot of knowledge and experience that you're not really aware of. So because when somebody asks you how to do it, that's the puzzle. Then somebody asks you how to do it, and then you have to think about that, reflect on how you come to know that, and then break down the various steps. So it could be something as mundane as kneading dough, recognising a face. We do recognise faces all the time, but do we know how we do that? And meet and greet rituals, which we take for granted unless we're going travelling or encounter somebody from a different culture who does things differently to us. And it's also the transfer of knowledge requires some sort of interaction with another person. So tying shoelaces is the example that I would use, and I would have to teach somebody how to do it and guide their fingers through that, the small child. So rather than just reading a book on tying shoelaces, you actually interact with the person. Same with things like riding a bike or learning a musical instrument. It's easier to learn those things when you're interacting in some way, which brings me up with the question of learning those practices through the internet, through YouTube. But I guess there's still, even though the interaction is more distant, there is still some sort of interaction with another person. Apprentices, for example, learn by observing and by practicing, by copying or mimicking those people that they're learning from as well. So that's all kind of tacit knowledge that after a while we've forgotten what it is that we know. And it is called know-how, and we have a lot of experience. So if you're with somebody who's an experienced plumber versus somebody who's learning on the job, you know that they know how to do that in a very skillful way, but they might not know how they know all of that because they will have been working on autopilot for quite some time. But according to Michael Polanyi and Fashon, there's contrast with what they call explicit knowledge. So if I want to know what the capital of the United Kingdom is, for example, then I would just look that up on the internet, and that's a very different way of learning something that's very easy, very explicit, than learning how to tie shoelaces or learning how to knead dough or learning how to recognize a face. How do we know how to do that? So reflection in action for Sean is the art, and he does think of it as an art, of dealing with situations of uncertainty. So this is the problem: uncertainty, instability, uniqueness, and value, conflict, and I'm quoting there. So he reckons that sometimes we're caught by surprise, and this is while we're in the middle of doing something. And as I said, he noticed that people went through this various phases, very like as Dewey talked about, no matter what field they were in. So they could be designers, they could be architects, they could be psychologists, but they would go through a reflective process as they're doing a particular job. So they're caught by surprise during the job. And so start to ask questions like, what am I noticing here? What are the features of this? How am I making this sort of judgment with this person that's different to somebody else that I'm seeing? What procedures am I using? How am I framing this problem? Because how we frame a problem will certainly impact on the solution to that problem. So if we frame a problem as somebody who's an addict and to blame for their problems, and the solution for that is going to be some very different from somebody that we frame as somebody who has a problem with addiction, and they have that problem of addiction because of the way that they've been treated in the past. So according to Sean, the idea about reflection in action, so reflection when we're in the middle of a project, is much reflection in action, he says, hinges on the experience of surprise. So when intuitive, spontaneous performance yields nothing more than the results expected for it, then we tend not to think about it. So if we can just be on automatic pilot, then we don't have to think about the problem. But when intuitive performance leads to, and he uses intuitive performance in the same way that I might say autopilot, when intuitive performance leads to surprises, whether that's pleasing and promising or totally unwanted, we may respond by reflecting in action. And when we do that in those processes, reflection tends to focus interactively on the outcomes of our action the action itself and the intuitive knowing implicit in the action as well. So we will have some knowledge or know-how that we can call on. So when practitioners are surprised, so when he's thinking about a practitioner, he's thinking about anybody who's practicing a job. If you think about lawyers, they're usually in a practice, medicos are in a medical practice, social workers think of themselves as practitioners. So there's an element of knowledge, but you're also surprised and learning about it as well. So that's his version of a practitioner, somebody who's practicing their craft or their art or their profession. So when practitioners are surprised, they have what he calls a reflective conversation with the situation. So what's going on with this particular situation? So it begins with an attempt to solve the problem. So I've got somebody here, I've never heard their story before, I'm a psychologist and I don't understand this particular thing. So I'll start to call upon my knowledge to I'll start to call on some of my experience and I'll be puzzled, but it's the puzzle that's the thing. So this might be a problem of making something, or in the case of being confronted as a psychologist with somebody I don't understand, then it is an attempt, it's a problem of trying to understand a situation that I've not come across before. And then you start to experiment. And this is what Sean noticed, whether he was talking with architects, designers, psychologists, is that you start to experiment with different ways of doing things. In the case of a person with a situation you've never come across before, you will call on previous knowledge, but that might not work, and so you'll think about something else. So you start to experiment about a particular situation. And then that's followed by reflection on the results of the experiment. So if my experiment is to teach my small child how to tie shoelaces, and the first time I try to do that, which is by telling the child how to do it, for example, and illustrating, showing my hands, then I might reflect that would just cause frustration and neither of us got anywhere with it. So I might then attempt another experiment, which is perhaps guiding their small hands so they get some feel of the shoelaces. And then I'll reflect on that. Now, if that works out more happily, then I'll continue that process. But it does lead to new questions and new outcomes and new knowledge as well. So we experiment and then we ask new questions. Well, this isn't working, let's try a different way, and that leads to new outcomes. So we're drawing on our experience, as I said, but we're also testing our hypotheses along the way. So this is what we're doing when we're reflecting in the middle of a situation. So thinking on our feet is probably a word that we could use to describe that. So reflection on action and where that difference comes is it is retrospective thinking about an event or a situation. So it's undertaken to think about the knowledge that we used and what knowledge would have been helpful. So we might be reflecting on a presentation that we've given, for example, where, and so the questions that we'd ask, well, what worked with that? Well, mostly that worked pretty well. I was able to remember most of the information without having to refer to my notes. What didn't work? Well, there was a patch of information there that I didn't know so well, and I laboured over that, and therefore I had to refer to my notes and I even had to read. So what could I have done differently? Well, perhaps I could have rehearsed that a whole lot more. And what new knowledge do I need for that? So maybe what I do need to consider is that through rehearsals, then it allows me to know what I'm very fluent on and what I'm not so fluent on, and perhaps I need to do more rehearsals than I normally would in some situations. So that's reflection on action, whereas the other type of reflection is reflection in action, when you're faced with a particular situation there and then. Reflection for action actually comes out of a criticism of Sean, that he didn't consider this, that he had reflection in action, which was very important to him. He had reflection on action, which is thinking about it afterwards, thinking about something retrospectively. We might use the word debriefing these days, but it is a form of reflection on action. But there was no reflection for action, which is a planning stage. So it's planning, thinking ahead, which enables us to draw on our experience and use available resources. So, for example, if I'm thinking ahead and I want to do a lecture and I've got 200 people coming, then thinking ahead requires me to go and make sure that I know how the equipment in that place works, particularly if it's a lecture theatre that I'm not familiar with. Make sure that all the audio equipment is working, and that I'm familiar how that particular lectern works. So I can then use on my experience of some equipment not working or it being unpredictable, and use available resources there. The advice from a few people that I've named on the slide is to plan, but don't hold too rigidly to a plan when we are doing our planning, and because flexibility is needed in case something doesn't go as predicted, which always reminds me of my youngest daughter, who was, when she was little, planning birthday parties, would have them planned down to the last 5 minutes of action, but humans are humans and small children are small children, and so things didn't go always according to how she planned them, and so she had to learn to become a little bit more flexible. So you kind of have to have your plan, but also be aware of things not going according to plan, and perhaps have a plan B, as we call it, and even a plan C. Self-questioning was very so if you're doing a reflective practice where you're relying on writing, then I guess you're self-questioning. If you're going to see a therapist or a counsellor or a supervisor, then a lot of the questioning will be done by the other person. But self-questioning was something that was really popular during the 1980s and 1990s, and it was thought to help students. So it was very much focused in terms of education. It was thought to help students get their attention focused on what they had to learn and get themselves organised around material, and then integrate whatever new knowledge they have with existing knowledge. And it has become very, very popular again recently in the 21st century, particularly in the workplace. Again, for those same reasons, that it allows us to focus our attention, it helps us to make better connections between various things so that we can solve problems, and it makes the thinking process more explicit so we can understand more about ourselves. The self-questioners, so if we're questioning ourselves rather than just relying on a supervisor, not that I want to exclude supervisors because somebody else asking questions is very, very useful, but self-questioners become aware of assumptions that you make, including for blind spots. So is this a good, I can ask myself, is this a good way to do this? Is there a better way to prepare for class? What will happen if I experiment? What will happen there? What are the consequences? So I can think through those things. One of the things that I'm very aware of since I became a student, I suppose, and it's a practice that's continued, is always be thinking about assumptions that I make towards other people. So I might walk away from an exchange and think, well, why was I thinking that about that particular person? So it allows me to challenge any assumptions that I might have about people, which might come from the broader culture. So why, when I walk past that particular group of people, did I feel unsafe, for example? Was it something that they did? Was it some stereotype that I held in mind? So I find that I continue that practice of self-questioning, not just in terms of my work, but also in terms of the knowledge that I have about how society is socially constructed, and how we're all kind of swimming in a sea of stereotypes, and how those stereotypes and thinking about people then inform and shape our thinking. So I use that to question my own thinking. And in terms of reflective learning, that's just it. It is about thinking about the framework of assumptions that we already take for granted, what we can do, what we can say, what we can think. Reflective learning is to question all of that all of the time. And I guess what I'm saying is that I've taken that from university education through to the rest of my life, that I continue. And because we are very much influenced by other people, what we can think about, what we can say, what is appropriate in particular situations. And we're also we're also influenced by other forces. For example, think about the habitus that we come from, our particular upbringing, social conventions. So if you're brought up in one environment or particular period of time where women were trained or expected not to say very much, then you might end up being an adult who doesn't say very much, and then you have to question that assumption. And the same with if you're a man. Men are expected to kind of take over and dominate conversations, and so learning about gender and gender dynamics, they then have to think about whether that's then appropriate. So it is thinking about all those that sea of stereotypes and expectations that we're all swimming in all of the time. I wanted to come now to situated reflective practice because it's another criticism of Sean, that not only did he not include the planning process, the reflection for action, that he also was very focused on an individual and rather than the particular settings. So other people have, particularly Malthouse, have corrected for that, and they've come up with something that they call situated reflective practice. And that concerns changes or situations that affect a person in really significant ways. But it focuses on the external events that emerge in our lives. So if you lose your job, often that happens not through anything that you have done. You might be retrenched, for example, or suddenly having your workload increased for whatever reason, because of a restructure, because of different requirements. So that's external events that emerge in our lives and then have quite a large impact. And it is interactional. So this is not just me doing things on my own. The context is a relationship between people, between plays, between what's happening. And so Malthouse et al. Focus on the physical setting, the social setting, and the individuals as well. And what they talk about there is they reckon that physical surroundings make a difference. So we take this into our reflection. So if you're a police officer, for example, then it makes quite a bit of difference going out and patrolling the streets at night time if you've got good lighting versus being in a place where the lighting is not very good. Or in hospital wards, for example, where medical staff are adequate for the job or not, or difficult patches of road. So these are all the sorts of things that we might have to think about, take into account our reflection when we're thinking about reflection in the workplace I've got here. So if you're a paramedic driving an ambulance, then part of your setting might be difficult patches of a road because there's construction going on, or the road hasn't been attended to and should have been attended to. And if you're a social worker or visiting people in their housing, then whether maybe you're a youth worker, for example, then the sort of housing complex that you're going into, or the particular housing situation for somebody, might feel safe in one situation and might not feel safe in another. If you're visiting, I've heard stories, for example, of people visiting people who are characterised as hoarders, and there's not even room to sit down in a place like that. So all of that informs and shapes your work, and so it's not just focusing on a particular problem without taking into account the physical setting as well is really the point in situated reflective practice, that we have to think beyond. We have to think about what else is going on in our physical surroundings. There are also going to be the social contexts which are bound up with what we're doing as well. So it's very different, for example, doing experiments in a laboratory where you can control of what's going on versus doing field work where you're going out into a community setting and you've got people there that you doing meetings with, etc., and you have a lot less control over that situation. Or a lecture is very different from small group activities that are assigned for you in a class versus perhaps doing a presentation that you're asked to do. All of those tasks, and they're all educational tasks, but they're all very different social settings as well. And then we have what they call the sort of relational formality within hierarchies. So I will have a different relationship with somebody who's a peer with me versus, for example, the Vice-Chancellor, who's many levels higher than me within the hierarchy of the university. So that's relational formality that they talk about. So all of that is bound up when we're thinking about reflective practice. All of that is bound within that particular situation as well. So, and people have different styles of reflective practice. So as I described an artist, for example, who for her the most important thing was actually to paint and reflect on her experience by painting through that. Other people prefer to write and they don't talk so much. Other people prefer to talk and they don't write so much. So all of those create something that's quite different to what Sean was talking about. It's a situated reflective practice where you're thinking about things far wider than just you as an individual. The characteristics of situated reflective practice is that often you are a passive observer as what is happening. For example, you become aware of a restructure in your workplace, and it might affect you and it might not, but at the moment you're really just a passive observer until you know what's going on. The other characteristic is that we experience by what Malthouse et al. Call proxy. So we notice what's going on because of treatment to other people. So an example there is people on benefit. So we have this experience by proxy. So we know that people on benefits aren't treated very well because we have friends who aren't treated very well when they're on benefits, or we are very aware of discussions in the newspapers at the present time or in the media where there's lots of stories of robo-debts and people who have their benefits suspended because they should be back at work and yet they've got medical certificates, etc. So that's an awareness by proxy. It's usually found in social organisations where power is separate from the person. So something's going on in a restructure that has nothing to do with me as an individual. The power is quite separate from me within that organisation, as it is for somebody on a benefit. The power is situated in Canberra, for example, or with Centrelink with a particular organisation. And things can happen now or they can happen later. In the example of a restructure, you become aware that this is going on around the place and you're aware of how that might be affecting some people, and you're aware, if they talk about experience by proxy, in a restructure you'll also be aware of how people are treated because they'll be talking about it. And this might be happening now, it could be happening later on, it might be just talk. And the other characteristic of situated reflective practice is that the power is separate from the person experiencing the situation. So there's a sense of helplessness there, that we can't do anything because the power is, we're not the ones in the position of power. So that's some of the circumstances under which we'd undergo this situated reflective practice. So the questions therefore tend to be, how would this situation affect me? How, if I'm going on benefits, is it going to affect me if I'm going to be treated badly? Maybe I'll choose not to go on benefits because of the stories that I hear, for example. Perhaps I'll just use my savings or struggle to get a job. Perhaps I just won't do it. Or how will this restructure affect me? Can I afford to get a job? Will I be treated by ageism in the workforce and find it very difficult? What would I do if I didn't have a job? Would I have enough superannuation? Is it easy enough to get a job these days? Will I need to do some retraining? What's going to happen? How will I manage that? How will I cope? How can I respond to this particular situation? And if you've been through a restructure, which I've been through a couple at the University of Adelaide, then you know that it's a very unnerving time for a lot of people because of these questions that they are asking, wondering how they are going to respond. But these self-questions, so we're back to the idea of self-questioning, is a way for us to search out things. We're looking for clarity. It does affect our identity as well. It's a very introspective process. We're going within, we're making some evaluations, and it's a strategy, I guess, to monitor and reflect on what it is that we're going to do, what strategies we're going to take. And so this, what Malthouse et al. Call this reflective intelligence, actually does allow people to cope with new situations. And it may be that people who are affected by restructures will go home and talk about that with their partners, for example. It may be that counselling is usually provided by large organisations, so they might call on that in order to be able to reflect on their situation and cope. So just to finish off, I just wanted to raise the question about the difference between being reflective and being reflexive. And so reflective is that process of thinking about the work that we do or other situations. So we use our critical thinking skills so that we're not operating on autopilot, or that intuitive performance that Sean was talking about. And one of the problems with I guess being on autopilot is that if we're on autopilot, we may actually behave in ways that don't accord with our values because we haven't stopped to think about it. We're just going ahead and not evaluating. We might be asked to do something And we're so used to obeying our bosses, for example, that we don't stop and think about whether we have a choice in that situation. And the difference between, so that's the process of thinking about it, whereas being reflexive is kind of to mirror the, mimic the mirror process. So you look in the mirror to see how things are going. So you're looking back on your own practice and self-analysis. It's a self-analysis, I guess. So we're thinking about things like, is our professional knowledge being used? Are our actions actually consistent with our values? Are we blindly being obedient to the bosses when actually what they're doing we don't agree with? Are there opportunities here for learning and growth? So what Thompson and Pascal say is that reflexivity actually allows us to make our reflective practice critical, so that we can ask those deeper questions about whether we are behaving in ways that we think that we should be behaving. So in summary then, reflection involves planning and preparing, thinking on the run. So planning and preparing is a reflection for action. Thinking on the run is reflection in action, and considering what worked and what could have been done differently. That's reflection on action, to use those John sort of terms. You can reflect on your own, for example, by writing, or with others, including a team at work. And it's a good idea usually with teams to do that. And by reflecting on what we do, we're learning from our experience, and we're stopping ourselves from being on an autopilot and therefore making the same mistakes over and over again. And we're thinking about things in different ways. And if we're thinking about things in different ways, then what we're doing is making new knowledge. And I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.